What I'm about to tell you will change how you see America's position in the world forever. I need to share something that happened last week. Something so unprecedented and revealing about the collapse of American strategic thinking that most people still can't believe it actually occurred. When you understand what truly happened behind closed doors, you'll realize we're witnessing the end of American dominance, not due to external forces, but because of sheer incompetence. Let me paint the picture for you. Last week, I started getting calls from contacts across Washington, all asking the same question: did Trump really just demand Canadian ports and water rights? The answer is yes. And Canada's response? A polite but devastating no. But here's the shocking part that no one is telling you. This wasn't just a diplomatic rejection. It was the sound of American leverage collapsing in real time. Let me explain. When American ports started buckling under the weight of tariff-induced chaos, container bookings falling, cargo volumes dropping, someone in the administration thought they had a brilliant idea. Demand access to Canadian infrastructure. Think about that for a moment. When your own policies destroy your own ports, the solution isn't to fix the policies. No, it's to demand that your neighbor bails you out. The hubris here is breathtaking. But the response from Canada was even more revealing. Mark Carney's rejection wasn't emotional or angry. It was surgical. He said, "Canada is not for sale." Those words were so clear, so final, that they left no room for misinterpretation. However, what Carney didn't say publicly should terrify every American strategic planner. Behind the scenes, Canada had been preparing for this moment for months. While Washington was busy creating chaos, Ottawa was quietly building alternatives. One such alternative was the Port of Churchill, a northern gateway that suddenly became incredibly strategic as traditional trade routes became unreliable. As a result, international shipping companies began showing serious interest in it. But there was something even more significant happening. Canadian exporters weren't just absorbing American pressure, they were actively redirecting their business away from American markets. European partnerships strengthened. Asian trade routes expanded. What seemed like Canadian weakness was, in reality, careful preparation. Then came the water demands. And this is where the situation becomes truly disturbing for anyone who understands resource geopolitics. As drought gripped much of the American South and West, Washington shifted from trade threats to resource demands. American officials began floating the idea that Canadian rivers, lakes, and freshwater resources were essentially strategic assets that could be accessed through pressure or leverage. Carney's response was immediate and devastating. Canada's water resources would not be treated like surplus inventory for another country's crisis. This was not just a diplomatic statement, it was a wake-up call. When you start treating a neighbor's natural resources as solutions to your own policy failures, you're not projecting strength, you're advertising weakness. The international community took note, especially when Washington reframed years of quiet technocratic agreements, such as the Columbia River Treaty, into leverage opportunities. Those negotiations collapsed almost overnight. Think about the consequences for the average American. Western states that had long assumed new water flows from Canada would materialize now had to face the reality of shortages. Farmers braced for crop yield devastation. Utilities scrambled to replace the hydroelectric power they relied on. A water resource manager in California told me, "We've been planning infrastructure investments based on political promises about Canadian cooperation." Those promises just evaporated. That's not policy failure, it's governance failure. And here's where it gets even more revealing. The markets saw this coming before Washington did. Investors had already started pricing in water scarcity risks for sectors that had never considered them before: agriculture, energy, advanced manufacturing. The international reaction was swift. When American officials suggested that long-standing protections for the Great Lakes could be reconsidered, the damage was immediate. Cities that rely on that water faced an uncertainty they'd never prepared for. For decades, American policy operated under the assumption that friendly neighbors would quietly absorb shocks and provide resources when needed. What Carney's firm refusal shattered was not just one request. It was the entire framework of American strategic dominance. When you treat essential resources like water as tools for political pressure, You cease to operate as a democracy. You become a state driven by coercion. What's even more concerning is Canada's response wasn't just defensive, it was strategically offensive. While rejecting American demands, Ottawa simultaneously deepened its relationships with European energy markets, expanded its trading partnerships with Asia, and began building alternative supply chains that reduced dependence on American cooperation. A former Canadian official summed it up perfectly. We spent generations assuming American partnership was permanent. We're now learning to plan as if it's optional. This shift from assuming permanent partnership to viewing cooperation as optional marks a fundamental reordering of North American power dynamics that most Americans haven't even begun to process. The psychological damage of this shift is even more disturbing when your closest neighbor begins treating its resources as strategic assets to be protected from your demands. What does that say about the state of the relationship? The international community is paying attention and they're noticing how the U.S. handled the crisis. In the 20th century, oil shocks reordered global power. Today, water is playing the same role. Countries that control fresh water are becoming the new gatekeepers in a world where drought is no longer an exception. It's the baseline, and they're taking notes on how the U.S. responds to scarcity, not through cooperation, but through pressure. Foreign investors are already quietly exploring Canadian water infrastructure. Other nations are modeling food security around access to Canadian resources instead of American ones. It's happening through planning documents, investment flows, and trade adjustments, slowly shifting who holds leverage. For Canada, refusing American demands wasn't just about national pride. It was about ensuring that once water resources are treated as tradable commodities under duress, they will never be protected again. For the U.S., the lesson is painful. Scarcity can't be bullied away. The Port of Churchill's story illustrates this perfectly. While American ports struggled with political volatility, Canada's northern gateway began attracting attention as a more reliable alternative. Shipping companies don't just switch back when the politics calm down. They've already adapted. The energy implications are just as serious. When hydroelectric cooperation breaks down, it isn't filled by magic. It's filled by dirtier, older power plants. Emissions rise. Costs rise, grid stability decreases. The environmental and economic costs of failed water diplomacy will show up in electricity bills and air quality in the American West. What makes this moment tragic is how avoidable it was. Canada never threatened American water security. They had been a reliable partner in resource management for years. The breakdown happened because American leadership confused short-term political tactics with long-term strategic thinking. We're watching a textbook example of how democracies sabotage themselves. When everything becomes political theater, technical cooperation becomes impossible. When partnerships are sacrificed for short-term political points, the damage builds in ways that take decades to undo. But here's the silver lining. Recognition is spreading that this approach has failed. Water managers, agricultural planners, energy executives, and port authorities are all realizing that when you treat essential partnerships as political props, you create real crises. The international community is already taking note of how the U.S. is mismanaging its relationships. When the world's largest economy can't manage a basic partnership with its closest neighbor over essential infrastructure, countries are already planning accordingly. What we are witnessing isn't just policy failure, it's the collapse of American strategic competence. Until leadership understands that resource security comes through cooperation, not coercion, this damage will only continue to grow, impacting every American's daily life. The choice ahead is clear: rebuild relationships based on mutual benefit and long-term planning, or continue down the path of resource nationalism, which is proving catastrophically counterproductive. Canada is showing us what competent resource stewardship looks like. We're showing them what happens when it disappears.